They called the United States the land of freedom. But before freedom came control. Before liberty came 170 years of chains. From 1607 to 1776, America was not America. It was a colony ruled, taxed, and exploited by the British Empire. This is the story of the dark side of British rule in America. A story of famine, slavery, rebellion, and the fight for independence. The year was 1607. A group of weary English settlers landed in Jamestown, Virginia. They were not conquerors, not kings, but men desperate for survival. At first, it was nothing more than a trading post, but behind them stood the might of England and a vision to build an empire across the Atlantic. Native Americans had lived in these lands for thousands of years. To them, these strangers were outsiders, but to the British, this was opportunity. New land, new resources, new wealth. Jamestown struggled in its early years. Famine, disease, and conflict with local tribes nearly wiped it out. But the colony survived, thanks to one thing: tobacco. Tobacco turned Virginia into a gold mine, and with profit came expansion. By the mid-1600s, more and more colonies sprouted along the eastern seaboard: Massachusetts, Maryland, Pennsylvania, the Carolinas. To the settlers, these colonies offered hope. To Britain, they were assets. Every crop grown, every trade made, every ship that left the harbors, all of it was controlled by London. The colonies could not trade freely. They could not pass their own laws without permission. They lived under the shadow of the crown. But profit came at a cost. The fields of Virginia and the Carolinas needed labor, and so began another dark chapter: slavery. Ships brought enslaved Africans across the Atlantic, chained in horrific conditions. By the 1700s, thousands of enslaved men, women, and children worked the plantations of British America. Tobacco, sugar, rice, and later cotton, all built on the backs of slaves. The wealth filled British coffers. The suffering remained in America's soil. For ordinary colonists, life was not free either. Heavy taxes, trade restrictions, laws written in London, enforced across an ocean. Even as towns grew and families spread across the land, they remained bound by invisible chains, the laws of an empire that saw them not as citizens, but as subjects. From 1607 to the early 1700s, the colonies expanded. But with expansion came control, and as Britain tightened its grip, resentment began to grow. Because no matter how far they were from London, the colonists could never escape the shadow of the British crown. By the early 1700s, the 13 colonies were no longer fragile settlements. They were thriving societies. Towns, farms, harbors, and plantations stretched across the Atlantic coast. But make no mistake, prosperity did not mean freedom. Every ounce of growth was tied to the British crown. Ships could not trade freely. Goods could not be sold without British approval. Even the timber cut from American forests, or the iron dug from its soil, had to pass through London before reaching the wider world. The colonies were rich in resources, but the wealth flowed across the ocean. The British Parliament passed a series of laws known as the Navigation Acts. On paper, they were about regulating trade. In reality, they were about control. American ships could only trade with Britain. American goods could only be shipped on British vessels, and certain products, sugar, tobacco, cotton, were reserved exclusively for the British market. The colonists worked the land. The British reaped the rewards. It was exploitation, wrapped in the language of law. Perhaps the deepest wound was political. The colonists paid taxes, heavy taxes, to Britain, but they had no say in British Parliament. They were taxed, but voiceless. Subjects, but not citizens. The phrase that would later ignite a revolution was already being whispered. No taxation without representation. The dark side of British rule was not only in trade and taxes, it was in people's lives. Native Americans were pushed from their lands, their treaties broken, their nations shattered. Enslaved Africans labored under brutal conditions, their lives treated as property. Poor settlers lived under crushing debts, while British merchants grew rich. The empire spoke of order and progress, but in reality, it built its empire on chains. As the 18th century moved forward, tension grew. The colonies were expanding rapidly. Population boomed. Towns bustled with trade. And yet, every decision, every law, every tax still came from across the sea. This was not independence. This was dependence. And the more the colonies grew, the more they began to question. How long could they live under another nation's shadow? The stage was set. The colonies had wealth, but no freedom. They had laws, but not justice. And soon, sparks of rebellion would ignite, sparks that would grow into the flames of revolution. By the mid-century, the British Empire had tightened its grip on America. Taxes grew heavier, laws grew stricter, and the colonies felt the weight of chains that stretched across the ocean. The people of America were angry, but anger alone was not enough. They needed a spark, and the British themselves would provide it. March 5th, 1770. A cold night in Boston. British soldiers stood guard in the streets, the symbol of empire's authority. A crowd gathered. Colonists shouted, mocked, threw snowballs laced with stones. The soldiers panicked. Shots rang out. 5 colonists fell dead on the street. The blood of innocent men stained Boston's snow. The British called it self-defense. The colonists called it murder. The Boston Massacre became a rallying cry. If Britain would kill its own subjects in cold blood, what freedom was left? Britain, drowning in debt from wars, passed the Tea Act. It gave the East India Company a monopoly on tea sales in America. For the colonists, this was the last straw. Tea was not just a drink, it was a symbol of daily life, and Britain had turned it into a tool of control. On December 16, 1773, in the Boston Harbor, American patriots disguised as Native Americans climbed aboard British ships. They smashed open chests of tea and hurled them into the sea. The water turned black with Britain's authority sinking beneath the waves. The message was clear. We will not drink your oppression. Britain struck back hard. In response to rebellion, Parliament passed the Coercive Acts, known in America as the Intolerable Acts. Boston Harbor was closed until the destroyed tea was paid for. Town meetings were banned. British soldiers could now live inside colonists' homes. Whether welcomed or not, it was collective punishment and empire's iron fists smashing down on an entire city. But instead of breaking the colonies, Britain united them. For the first time, leaders from across America gathered. They saw clearly Britain would never treat them as equals. Whispers of rebellion grew louder. Pamphlets were written. Committees of correspondence spread messages across towns. Ordinary farmers, blacksmiths, and merchants began calling themselves patriots. They were no longer just colonists. They were a people awakening to the idea of freedom, and they were ready to fight for it. The Boston Massacre had spilled blood. The Boston Tea Party had defied an empire, and the Intolerable Acts had proven that Britain would crush liberty without hesitation. The colonies stood at a crossroads: submit to the empire, or take the road of revolution. April 19, 1775. The quiet villages of Lexington and Concord awoke to the sound of marching boots. British soldiers, sent to seize weapons hidden by the colonists, believed they would crush rebellion in a single blow. But when they arrived, armed farmers, simple men with muskets stood in their way. The British commanders shouted for them to disperse. Then a single shot rang out. No one knows who fired it, but history remembers it as the shot heard round the world in that moment. War had begun. The farmers of Massachusetts fought not as soldiers but as patriots defending their homes. They chased the British back to Boston, firing from behind trees and stone walls. The empire that ruled half the world had just been humiliated by villagers. This was not a rebellion anymore. It was the birth of a revolution. By 1775, representatives from all 13 colonies gathered once again. At first, many still hoped for peace with Britain. They wrote petitions. They begged the king to listen. But King George III responded with fury. He declared the colonies in open rebellion. To him, they were traitors. And traitors deserved the noose. Slowly, the dream of reconciliation died. In its place rose something far more dangerous. The dream of independence. On July 4th, 1776, in Philadelphia, the colonies made their decision known to the world. Thomas Jefferson's words echoed like thunder. All men are created equal, with the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. For the first time, a people declared not just war, but the right to be free. The British Empire had called them subjects. Now, they called themselves Americans. The war in America was no longer just a local struggle. It became a war that shook the foundations of the empire. France, Britain's old enemy, secretly supported the rebels. Soon, European powers would turn the American Revolution into a global conflict. The colonies were weak. Britain was strong. But the cause of freedom had lit a fire that no empire could easily put out. From Lexington to Philadelphia, from muskets to declarations, the colonies had crossed a line that could never be undone. They were no longer fighting for fair treatment. They were fighting for independence. And the empire that had ruled them for 170 years was about to face its greatest defeat. After the Declaration of Independence in 1776, the British Empire unleashed its full military might. Warships crossed the Atlantic. Redcoats marched across the colonies. The message was clear. The world's strongest empire would not be humiliated by farmers and rebels. But Britain did not come only to fight soldiers. They came to crush the spirit of an entire people. Wherever the British army marched, villages burned, homes were seized, civilians were beaten, starved, and left homeless. British commanders believed fear would force the colonists into submission, but instead of breaking their will, it hardened their resolve. Thousands of prisoners were packed into filthy prison ships off the American coast. Disease spread like wildfire. It is said that more Americans died in those floating prisons than on the battlefield itself. This was not just a war for territory. It was a war of survival. The first major showdown came in New York. Washington's poorly trained army faced the full force of the British military. The result was devastating. Thousands of Americans were killed or captured. The Continental Army barely escaped into the night. For money. It seemed the revolution was doomed before it had truly begun. If British bullets did not kill the revolution, winter nearly did. At Valley Forge, American soldiers froze in the snow, starving and diseased. They wrapped their feet in rags. They boiled leather to eat. The British believed the rebels would simply wither away. But instead, out of that suffering, the Americans found discipline, unity, and strength. On Christmas night, Washington crossed the icy Delaware River. In the dead of winter, his army struck the British-allied Hessian mercenaries in Trenton. The victory was small, but symbolic for the first time. America proved it could strike back. The empire was not invincible. The war had become brutal. Entire towns suffered. Prisoners died in chains. Soldiers froze in the snow. Yet, through blood and fire, the revolution still burned. But soon, help would come from across the ocean, and that help would change everything. By 1778, the impossible had happened. France, Britain's greatest rival, entered the war on America's side. With French ships at sea and French gold in American pockets, the balance shifted. The British Empire, stretched thin across the globe, began to stumble. In October 1781, the end came at Yorktown, Virginia. British General Cornwallis found himself trapped American troops on land, French fleets at sea, surrounded, cut off, and exhausted. The proud British army had no choice but to surrender. When Cornwallis's soldiers laid down their arms, the world witnessed a miracle. The most powerful empire on earth had been defeated by its own colonies. The Treaty of Paris officially ended the war. America was free, but freedom had come at a heavy cost. Tens of thousands dead. Scythia's burned, families torn apart. The British Empire had ruled America for 170 years with iron chains, taxation, and bloodshed. And in the end, their cruelty created the very rebellion that destroyed their rule. The story of Britain's control over America is not just about battles and treaties. It is about ordinary people crushed under empire. It is about chains, prisons, massacres, and starvation. Yet it is also about resilience, a people who refuse to bow forever. For 170 years, America lived in the shadow of Britain's power, but in the end, the shadow collapsed. The empire that once ruled the world was forced to bow before its own subjects. This was the dark side of British rule in America. If you found this story powerful, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to Dark Past TV, and hit the bell icon, because more untold stories of empires, wars, and the dark side of history are coming soon.